Welcome back. Now in this topic, we are going to be discussing more about what is a belated return, what is a loss return, what is a revised return, when can I revise the return, and some questions which you will need to understand to be able to answer the question papers. Now we've already talked about two types of returns. We said one is an original return, the other is a belated return. The original return we've talked about in detail needs to be filed before the due date, which is either 31st July, 30th September or 30th November. We've talked about returns to be filed electronically. We've talked about returns with digital signature or without. Hopefully you've read the notes in detail and have those provisions inside your head. Now comes the question, can I file a return after the due date? Well, the answer is yes, but as per section 139(4). So now, let's say this is the due date. This is the previous year. Now, beta, the law for 13-14, 14-15, 15-16, the basic provisions remain exactly the same, apart from few amendments. Now, for assessment procedures, even in the paper, the questions may relate to not just 14-15, but the question may be of 12-13, the question may be of 13-14, because the due dates for these years may fall in the current year. Now, my experience tells me, so it's easier for you to comprehend years and dates which you are already aware of. So, I might take some examples of 13-14 or 12-13 as well. So, this example, to make you understand the entire story, is going to be for 13-14. Therefore, we have April, May, June and July. I am assuming the due date to be 31st of July. Any return filed over here is a return under 139(1). The belated return can be filed within 1 year from the end of the relevant assessment year. So we have assessment year 2014-15 ending on 31st March 15. One more year, 31st March 16. We also learned that the assessing officer has the power to ask you to file a return. The power is under section 142(1)(1). The details of this section we will do when we go to the powers of the AO or the functions of the AO. Remember, at the moment I told you we are talking about what the assessee can do. So I'm going to give you just in brief what 142(1)(1) says. 142(1)(1) says that by a notice, the AO can ask the assessee to file a return. Now the questions will be, can the AO send a notice during this period before the due date? Well, of course not. Why not? Because abhi yaar return ka time is not gone, no? So if there is the return time not gone, I told you this is Lakshman Rekha. So no notice under 142(1)(1) can be sent here. What if the assessee has already filed a return here before the due date? Can the AO now send a notice seeking another return under 142(1)(1)? Well, the wordings of 142(1)(1) start that where an assessee has not furnished a return. Therefore, it is very apparent that if you furnish a return before the due date, then a notice under 142(1)(1) cannot be sent. That means If a return under 139.1 has been furnished, then no notice under 142.11. Then comes the question that since I have a time period to file a return under 139.4, does that mean that the notice can only be sent after 31st March 16? Because the section says where a return has not been filed. So the assessee is likely to raise a point that if the time period to file a return still exists, the belated return, then the notice can only be issued to me once that time period ends. That is the wrong thinking. Because as per law, the moment this date is crossed, now your safety factor goes. Belated return is not your right, it's a privilege. And please understand the difference between the words. Belated return, the filing of a return late, is not your right. I call it a privilege. That means you can't demand it. By chance you could not file it before the due date, you had some issues or maybe you forgot, you can file a return late unless you're caught. Because when we read the time period to file a belated return, let's go and do that. Section 139.4 says, if a person has not furnished a return within the time allowed under 139 or within the time allowed in a notice under 142.1, then he may furnish the return of income at any time before the expiry of 1 year from the end of the relevant assessment year or before the completion of assessment, whichever is earlier. Now, to be able to understand this, I'm going to teach you a bit about assessments, a bit about the completion of assessments as well. So we go back. So the time period for a belated return is 1 year from the end of relevant assessment year or completion of assessment. Whichever is earlier. But before we are doing that, we are first understanding, can a notice under 142.11 be issued within this period as well? Well, the answer is yes. That means after the due date, there are two types of returns possible. And I want you listening very carefully to this. One is a return in pursuance of a notice under 142.11 and the other is a return under 139.4. That means after the due date, there are two things. Either there is no notice issued to you, so you get this time period. If you file a return, it's a valid return, it's a belated return. But if during this period you get a notice under 142.11, the notice will specify the time period within which you are required to file a return. So if you file a return within that time period, that's a return under 142.11. So we take examples. We say assessee files a return on 1/1/15 under 139.4. Now the forms of returns are exactly the same. That means whether I'm filing an original return or a belated return or for that matter a revised return, well, the form will remain the same. This is ITR 1 form, also referred to as Sahaj. Now, over here, if you notice, if you're filing a return before the due date, you specify that. If you're filing after the due date, you take 139.4. If it's a revised return, you fill this. Or if it's in response to a notice under 142.1. And slowly when we do 147, you will understand that there's a notice under 148. Defective return 139 or a return for block assessment 153A, B or C. So the form of return remains exactly the same. So if you're filing a belated return, you will just tick 139.4 and fill up the form. So we were saying this is a return under 139.4. But what if I now receive a notice on 1/3/15 under 142.11 seeking a return that I am going to be filing. Now this notice is not valid because I have already filed the return on the date I received the notice. Had this notice been received on 1/11/14, obviously by that time I have yet to file a return. 142.11. Now the notice gives me 20 days to file a return. The day of service of notice will be excluded. So the first we will exclude. We have 20 days to file a return. That makes it 21st of November 2014. If the return of income is filed within this time period, let's say 20th, then this is after the due date, but it is a return within the time period mentioned in the notice under 142.11. Therefore, it's a return, we say, under 142.11. Is it a belated return? The answer is no. Now, what is the difference between a return under 142.11 and a return under 139.4? Let's go and check. One, these are after the due date. Both of these are out after the due date. But by the wordings of section 139.4, be rest assured, have a look, read. If a person has not furnished a return within the time allowed under 139.1 or within the time allowed for a notice under 142.1, then the return filed is a belated return. Therefore, by this very definition of the belated return, a return under 142.11 is not a belated return. It is after the due date, yes, but it is not a belated return. Then as per section 80, we have carry forward of losses. Is the restriction of section 80 applicable to both these returns? Which means whether I file a return under 139.4 or I file a return under 142.11, there can be no carry forward of loss. Except when we did set off, we talked about 71B, which is house property loss, 32.2, unabsorbed depreciation, and we need to mention over here 73A, which is specified businesses, covered by 35 AD. If you remember, and you should, we had cross-country natural gas, cold storage, warehousing for agriculture produce, and all those specified businesses where the entire capital asset cost was allowed as a deduction. Now these three are not mentioned under section 80. Therefore, these three losses can be carried forward even if the return is filed late. And when I say late, is after the due date, because section 80 is only concerned with the time period under 139.1. So section 80 says to carry forward all losses, you need to file the return before the due date under 139.1. Thus, the restriction of section 80 is applicable to both the returns. Then we talk about revised return. Now, as per section 139.5, a benefit has been given. This return can be revised, this cannot be revised. Which means if you file a return, and we will do questions in a little while, if you file a return within the time period of the notice, well, at least you've complied with that part. Then we look at penalty under 271F and interest under 234A. Well, it brings us to the question that if I am not compulsorily required to file a return, no compulsion. Let's say my total income or the GTI before deductions is 1,80,000. Now, I do not require to file, I'm being an individual, I am not compulsorily required to file a return. But if I do file a belated return, Now in this case, obviously no penalty is leviable because I am not compulsorily required to file a return. There will be no interest because remember, interest is based on tax. And when this is no tax, there is no interest. Similarly, there will be no penalty or interest here. But if the question again, would be here. Can I get a notice under 142.11 even if I am not compulsorily required to file a return? Yes. Now if the AO feels that he wants to check your income and he wants to see your return, well, he can send you a notice. Even if your income as per your calculation is less than the minimum exemption slab and you are not compulsorily required as per 139.1 to file a return, once you get a notice. Now to file a return under 142.11 will be compulsory. Now under 142.11 and 139.4, if it was compulsory, say the assessee had a tax which was coming to 4 lakhs. Now he should have filed a return under 139.1. If he files a belated return, will be leviable. Of course, after the end of the relevant assessment year, interest under 234A will be levied. Similarly, it will be levied here. Even if you file the return within the time period mentioned under 142.11. Only then am I talking about the return under 142.11 within time of notice. Now what happens if you default? In complying with terms of notice? That means over here, you got a notice, you needed to file a return within 20 days, but you did not. But you did file it, let's say by 22nd of November 14. That means you filed a return, but after the due date or after the date mentioned in the notice. Is that a valid return? Well, it's not a return under 142.11. That's for sure. But since it is within the time period, in the notice under 139.4, within the time period of section 139.4, it is within 1 year from the end of the relevant assessment year. Assessment has yet to be completed. Well, it is a valid return. But this time, it's a return under 139.4. So we say default in complying with the terms of notice. That means return is filed after time period. Then it can be a return under 139.4 if within time mentioned there. Well, I'm going a little slow and I want you to understand these provisions because only then will you be able to answer the questions we're going to raise in the next few minutes. In addition to that, there is a penalty prescribed, rupees 10,000. Now this penalty is for default of 142.11. This will be in addition to penalty and interest which is for default of 139.1. If you did not file a return, you got a notice but you did not file a return at all. You did not reply to the notice. That means now what you've done is you got a notice under 142.11, no reply, no return has been filed. Well, now we know there is a penalty of 271(1)(c), which is 10,000. And in addition to this, now this default is covered by 144, which means now the AO may proceed with best judgment assessment. So there are a lot of consequences if you do not comply with these, and you need to memorize these. When I do 142.11, we will probably go through them again. Let's go through these charts again. So a return after the due date is either a return under 142.11 or a return under 139.4. Can I get a notice under 142.11 before the due date? No. Can I get a notice under 142.11 after the due date? Yes. Can the assessee say I still have time period to file a belated return? No, because filing a belated return is your right. No. It's a privilege. It's not a right. What if I do file a return within the time period mentioned in the notice? Well, it's a return filed late, but it is within the time period of the notice. It can be revised. But if you were compulsorily required to file a return under 139.1, you will be levied interest and penalty. Losses cannot be carried forward because Section 80 gives no special privilege to such a return. It only says the return should be before the due date under 139.1. However, we know now house property loss, unabsorbed depreciation, and specified business loss can be carried forward because these are not restricted by Section 80. One of the reasons is this section was added after Section 80 was, and so was this. Then, if there is a default under 142.11, there is a penalty of 10,000 rupees. And if you do file a return after this notice, it may still be a valid return, this time under 139.4, but then penalty can be levied. A notice under 142.11 can be sent even if you were not compulsorily required to file a return under 139.1. And the default of 142.11 may even lead to the best judgment assessment.